everybody, and welcome to Fraudible, the official podcast of the International Society of Economic and Criminology. Fraudible is the video podcast that brings together academics and practitioners to discuss all things fraud. In this episode, we're going to be discussing fraud and technology, and I'm delighted to be joined by academic Dr. Michael McGuire and practitioner Geoff White. And thank you so much both for joining me. Michael, could you please give us a brief introduction to yourself and your work?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm Dr. Michael McGuire. I'm a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Surrey. And I guess I've been working on cybercrime, as it used to be called. I don't like to call it that anymore, but, in that space, probably since the mid-1990s. So I've seen a lot of things change, a lot of things develop. I've written 2 books in the area. I've just about to publish my 3rd book, which is something I'm kind of guessing we're going to get onto today quite a lot. It's all about the role of platforms in perpetrating digital crime. And of course, they are very important sort of enablers of fraud as well. So this book's called Platform Criminality in Post-Crime. The idea is that fraud fraud is normalizing crime to the extent that we can almost think of a post-crime environment. I'll leave it there in terms of one thing I will say is that I did a big piece of research, which the book was based on what I referred to as the digital crime economy. And we'll come to that, I guess, during our discussion as well. But the project was called Web of Profit. It was done with actually a bunch of practitioners rather than academics. It was very instructive to work in that space. What I found in that research really surprised me and led to the book.
Amazing. Thank you very much. And Geoff, the same to you, please.
So I'm Geoff White. I'm an author and investigative journalist. And what I cover is the intersection of organised crime and technology. So wherever organised crime and tech hang out, that tends to be where I am. So obviously looked a lot about cybercrime, fraud, money laundering, paedophile networks, child sexual abuse networks online, net dating fraud. So wherever fraud and organised crime and tech hang out, that's where it tend to be. It's interesting to be described as a practitioner in this space. I should point out, I neither practice fraud myself, nor do I practice anti-fraud. So I come at it as a journalist. That's my lookout. And the last book I wrote was published last year. It's all about money laundering and technology and how tech is changing the money laundering scene.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Michael, let's start with you then. So your most recent book that's coming out very soon, what was it about the research that you did that surprised you so much? Well,
one of the things that, Geoff, as a sort of investigative journalist in this area, will have, covered some of these issues. And I have to say, that as an academic researcher, we owe a great deal to the journalist in this space, because it's not, academic research tends to be quite slow. And if you publish a book in a paper, it can be several years after the event. So really, to get the up-to-date stuff, it's great to have tech journalists and people who are aware in that space. So, thanks to Geoff for the work he's doing in that area. What I wanted to do was look at, it was actually, initially the research was commissioned by a company called Bromium, who have now amalgamated with HP. They were doing some very interesting work with fraud prevention. And what they were interested in was the cash flows in cybercrime. And we've looked at, a lot of people have done research on how much cybercrime costs the economy. I've always regarded that as a very spurious statistic because, how you can actually measure exactly what cost and who's damaged and so on usually ends up with being quite a lot of spurious statistics. So I wanted to tackle it from the other end, which I think is a much more interesting end, which is what kind of revenues are cyber criminals generating? Because from that we can kind of read back to costs to a certain extent, but we can also learn a lot more because we can learn about, well, how much money are they earning, what are they doing with it, and where are they putting it? So the book, the initial research tried to come up with a kind of an analysis of certain areas of cybercrime and how much money they were generating. And without going into all the details of that, and I'm boring you with too much of that, there was, a limited sample of data that I could actually use. Because the data at that point, it still is not great, but it was certainly not great at that point. I came up with a figure of around about 1.1 or $1.2 trillion that the cybercrime economy is generating, and that is a conservative estimate. I mean, again, I could go through some of the stats and the data around that, but it'd be quite a long process. For my book, I've updated that research, so it's a 2025 figure, and the figure now is closer to 1.5 trillion. Which I found absolutely staggering. And as I say, I was being every step along the way, every metric I used, every piece of research data I drew upon, I tried to take the lowest end of the spectrum to only include what we were most sure about. And on that basis, I suspect that the amount of money that's been generated is a hell of a lot more. When you look at that compared to the GDP of certain nation states, it is far in excess. I mean, Geoff will talk to us a bit more about the organised side of this, but clearly there isn't a union of cyber criminals where they're all generating this money and spending it in a consistent and organised way in the same way as a state would do. But nonetheless, that's a lot of money swirling around. And one of the things that I tried to do is, first of all, to see how it was generated in the first place. What were the techniques they were using? Fraud is a major part of that, perhaps not in quite the way that you would expect, and we'll come back to that. But then it's, where does the money go? And this is where the money laundering side of it comes into, and Geoff will tell us a lot more about some of the technology attached to that. But it was fascinating really to see just how much the digital crime economy is being enabled by money laundering technologies in all kinds of ways. And then finally, and this was one of the really interesting questions, I managed to speak to a lot of people who were in prison for fraud and cyber crimes. How do they spend this money? What do they do with it? And when you start to look at how either it's spent slightly chaotically or hedonistically, but also how much of it is being reinvested back into crime, you think of $1.5 trillion, 20% of those revenues are going back into funding further crime, sometimes by the criminals, but sometimes by nation states who are also very heavily implicated in this space. So I guess that was, a quite a long answer to your short question. One of the things that really fascinated me was how much money was being made, the diversity of means for making it, and how it's being moved around. Just quickly, finally, to update where the book went, and to relate it to what Geoff's expertise is in. The thing that has really staggered me as I've looked into this further is the organizational capacity. So there's a lot to say about the interface between technology and crime, and it's not been done very well. And I've got lots of arguments about why it's been handled very badly. But the new thing that's come into the scene is the platform. And the platform is an organizational medium, a very different kind of organizational form than we'd be used to in traditional organized crime with hierarchical structures and so on. Platforms enable, they mediate in ways almost, without there needing to be organization. But what they've done is radically change digital crime. We know they've changed, the legitimate economy, because the people who make the most money in the legitimate economy at the moment are the big platforms. And criminals have not been far behind using similar techniques. So I think, and fraud articulated through platforms, there's a lot to say about that. But that was what surprised me anyway.
Amazing. Thank you. Geoff, thoughts?
It's really interesting. I mean, that figure of 1.2 to 1.5 trillion is absolutely astonishing. But I wanted to ask, Michael, in terms of that, how much are you including in that sort of cybercrime thing? Because obviously there's different types. I'm interested in the sort of cyber-enabled fraud, the kind of business email compromise stuff. What does that sort of cover, that sort of 1.5-ish trillion or something?
There were five metrics that I used. So one was counterfeit goods, counterfeit pharmaceuticals, and so on, which obviously is fraud. It's deceptive sales of for personal gain. Now it's an interesting point you make about how much you consider that to be, what's included in cybercrime, because it's one of those slightly grey areas where a lot of certainly academics writing in the cybercrime field tend to slightly downplay counterfeits and fake goods, even though actually it's the largest slice of the cybercrime economy. It's it's 500-600 billion upwards, and so that was one anyway, and that was surprising just how much money has been made, although perhaps not surprising when you really reflect upon it, because e-commerce is clearly at the heart of the digital economy, and therefore it's not surprising that e-commerce would be a driver of the cybercrime economy. So I looked at the metrics for counterfeit goods, counterfeit pharmaceuticals. I looked at cybercrime as a service, and the kind of the tools and services as well that are being bought and sold there. I looked at data, the data economy as a component of the cybercrime economy, because the buying and selling of data, whether it's the old-fashioned stuff like getting credit card details and credentials, or whether it's much more elaborate forms of data that are being sold across the darknet and beyond. And then I looked at IP theft, which I distinguished very carefully from counterfeits, and that would be things like trade secret theft, theft of ideas and so on. And that's quite a substantial part of the economy. And then I looked at ransomware, because the revenues being made from things like malware attacks and so on, it's quite hard to disaggregate that. Ransomware is easier because we've got an evidence trail there, not least, and you probably are more on top of this than I am, things like the blockchain, what we know, really good companies like Chainalysis are looking at how, you can associate certain accounts, Bitcoin accounts, with certain types of ransomware attacks. So you can get a pretty substantive idea of how much money is being made off ransomware. It's actually very small. The threat posed by ransomware is much more existential. It's obviously to networks and systems. But in terms of the revenues generated, if you want to be a cyber criminal, you want to be selling fake goods on Amazon, really, or Temu. That's where you're going to make your money.
I shall make a note.
So interesting. Because that ties in with, it's really interesting that much as I'm interested in ransomware, and I'm currently putting together a BBC podcast series on that subject. So it is fascinating, and it you're right, Mark. I think it's the threat to networks that's terrifying about that, and also the fact that ransomware isn't just an organised crime money-making enterprise. Ransomware also gets used on a sort of geopolitical cyber warfare type level, so it crosses a few different things. Even if you're not so worried about the money in ransomware, the nation-state threat is there, which is interesting. But the counterfeit goods stuff is really interesting. One of the cases that the FBI looked into was to do with North Korea. I've done a lot of stuff, obviously, on North Korean cybercrime and North Korean sort of organised crime links. And we've always been interested in where this money sort of goes. How does North Korea use this money, that it's accused of stealing and hacking, and what's the industry behind it? And one of the things they're accused of doing is channeling money via a guy called, I think his name was Sim Hyun Sop was his name. And he was a key individual, according to the FBI, certainly, in this sort of North Korean cyber economy. And part of what he was doing was counterfeit cigarettes. And I couldn't quite believe this, that, after all of these investigations, this high-tech stuff that I did about North Koreans hacking into banks and crypto companies and stealing money and washing it through mixers and stuff, at the back of it was moody snouts, as we'd call them in the UK, how, but then you realise, how much of a cigarette is actually tax and duty and VAT and all these kind of things. And if you're making them on the sly, you don't pay any of that. So immediately, every cigarette you sell, if you're selling it for the same price, you're making 40% or 50% more, whatever the government's share of a cigarette is. It's immediately hugely profitable. And of course, you make them with the cheapest paper and the cheapest materials and cheapest boxing and everything. So you can make loads of money out of that. I just think it's really interesting, Michael, that you've taken that into account, because it is fraud. It's definitely a form of fraud, and can be hugely profitable, because we've built up these kind of regulation, taxation buffers around these industries. And if you can just bypass those, that's profit. That's all profit. I thought it's interesting.
Yeah, and it's some of the big organised groups, big organised digital crime groups, like Kraken and some of the ones on darknets, that they're the ones that get the attraction. But actually, it's often the smaller vendors, when you accumulate the profits that small businesses are making through sites like Amazon, Temu, all these e-commerce sites, that they're generating a lot of money on the side. And you're absolutely right. The nation state complex is something we cannot overlook in this space. in any respect. And of course, North Korea is, you're saying where the money goes. Well, people have, as you'll be well aware, have spoken apocryphally of it funding their missile program. It funds the building programs, the vanity building programs. I see they've just built a kind of a North Korean Benidorm. I don't know how much of that came from, but I mean, they are prepared to multitask. I think that's, again, one of the interesting things we're seeing with the digital crime scene is the polyvalence of skills that are involved here. So somebody might well be involved in selling counterfeit cigarettes, but they might also be acting as a funnel to channel money in from an ATM heist that North Korea has done in Pakistan and India, and to pull in the funds from that. And of course, all the cryptocurrency exchanges that they've been regularly raiding. And this really relates back to one of the things I was saying at the beginning about this, what I'm calling post-crime, where you get this blurring of agency. States are digital criminals. I mean, there's no question about it. Facebook, Meta, is a digital criminal. All of the big platforms are if you actually boil it down to how we define criminality and violations of laws, of abuse of victims and so on. I mean, we have a spectrum of criminals, and fraud is at the center of this because it is, as many people would think of it, as a victimless crime. And so we get this interesting continuities between perpetrators, victims, the way we think about crime and the way we kind of fight crime, and the inadequacy of our fight against fraud, which I'm sure we'll come on to regularly throughout this talk, is at the centre of this, isn't it? I mean, it's just, it's out of control for a very good reason.
I feel like technology has become a bit of a buzzword in the financial crime space. You hear a lot of financial crime has increased because of and technological advances. I feel like that's a phrase that's been used over decades. Is that accurate? Is it really broad? Do we need to start to use a more specific term? Because if you're saying technological advances, do we think that the public might just think mobiles, laptops, and not necessarily the more specific technologies that are being used? Is that, as a term, is it fairly obsolete now, or do you think it's still fairly accurate?
I think it's fair to say that technology is a huge enabler in financial crime. And the way I break it down is looking at traditional finance and what you might call new finance. Traditional finance being banks, fiat currency, etc. New finance being, well, yes, obviously cryptocurrency, but also you've got to look a bit more widely than that. In-game video game currencies, for example, NFTs, these sort of new stores of value. And I mean, technology has crashed into both of those and created big opportunities particularly for money launderers, but financial crime as well. In the traditional finance world, you've got this hunger for faster technology, faster payments, faster transfers, faster account creation. And that's driven, as far as banks are concerned, by consumer demand. I would push back on that and say, as a consumer, if you take 5 more minutes of opening my bank account so it doesn't get used for fraud, I regard that as a selling point because I trust that financial institution more. But I know people inside the bank who would say, no, we need people to be able to open an account in 6 clicks. So there's sort of consumer hunger is allegedly driving that use of technology. What this does is creates a faster, less friction environment. Beneficial for consumers, of course, for customers, but also beneficial for money launderers who can now bounce their money through several accounts because money moves instantly. So that technological wave has rolled over traditional finance and created these opportunities. In terms of new finance, the point I try and make in the book, in Rinsed, is it's not that it's not that technologists set up in the morning and wake up in the morning and set out to create financial crime and money laundering friendly technologies. I genuinely don't think that's most of the time what they're doing. What they're doing is wanting to disrupt, to create, to innovate. But what's interesting is the things that they do as part of that tend to be things that are really useful for money launderers. So as a techie, as a startup, you're looking to set up a marketplace where there's kind of febrile trading. I mean, Uber's the classic thing. How much is an Uber taxi worth? Well, it depends, doesn't it? We let the market go. We create this febrile hands-off marketplace. So hands-off fee bar marketplace, number one. Secondly, the techies want international. They want to be able to launch their app internationally all over the globe. And the third thing is techies tend to target areas where there's lack of regulation or where regulation's behind, because that's where the business opportunity is. Again, Uber went to taxis because taxis was old regulation. Think about what money launderers want. Well, you want to drop your $1 million of dodgy money into some febrile market where it's not going to stand out. Great, the techies are there. You want to be able to drop your money in London, withdraw it in Los Angeles. Great, these international apps will do that. The in-game video game currencies do not care where their users are. They want their currency to be uniform across the world of their players. And also lack of regulation. Technology is always the place where regulation struggles to keep up. It's always on the cutting edge. So it's not that techies deliberately set out to create financial crime and laundering opportunities. It's just that the techies often create stuff that happens to be really of use to those crooks. So in terms of technology, I think actually the broadness of the term technology helps us in a way to kind of be able to discuss the full suite of things. As you drill down into it, you get into different types of technology. Sure. But I think it's useful to sort of look at tech as a broad enabler.
Any thoughts on that, Michael?
Yeah, lots actually. I think I've written a lot about technology in my work and its role as how it intersects with digital crime, because we've got a big conceptual problem, certainly in criminology, but I think more broadly there is a very lazy set of conceptual frameworks around technology, and we just use the term in a very, very generic way, in ways which actually ultimately make it devoid of meaning. One problem immediately is this concept of enablement. This is something I've attacked regularly, because it's one of these words that you drop it into a sentence and it seems like it means something. And the police use it, politicians use it, it's used all over the place. Technology enables this or enables that. In fact, it doesn't really mean anything, because what you're actually are talking about is some sort of causal impact that the technology has. And when you dive down into how enablement takes place, things start to become very, very confusing, because to what extent, does, supposing you want to look at, a fraud against a senior citizen, to what extent does the computer enable the fraud, the network enable the fraud, the interaction between the perpetrator and the victim enable the fraud? And you can do some very simple analysis where you show actually that enablement has got a lot of ambiguities to it. So, for example, supposing there's what in the legal world they call the car key story. So, for example, you lose your car key, and a thief finds your car, drives, or rather you leave the key in the car, and then you walk away and forget about it. A thief takes the car, drives the car away, crashes, kills somebody. So, in effect, you have enabled that death. Are you legally culpable for that death? Well, the legal profession would say no, because enablement doesn't really add anything to the crime at that point. It's the person who's driven the car and crashed it and so on who's actually responsible. But you could certainly consistently and logically say that the person who left the key in the car has enabled the death of that individual. So once you start to dive down, it starts to become very, very blurry. So we have to be really precise about how the technology adds to what we do. And there are lots and lots of frameworks which I've worked with and developed, and it's really much more to do with, and this takes us right back to this issue about technology or the human factor, which gets spoken about a lot. And it's always the human factor, really, at the end of the day, because what the technology does is do nothing other than to add to what we as humans can do. So people talk about augmentation. So we augment our bodies to be able to talk to somebody on the other side of the world, or to be able to remove money from their bank account. We extend what we can do anyway as human beings. So enablement is really augmentation. And the second factor is connection. And a connection is hyperconnection, as I call it, is a way in which we have exactly the same societal order in play, and fraud is about deceiving people, playing on human abilities. And if you can do it in a more connected way, then obviously you're going to be more successful. It's just, the old style fraudster back in the 1920s would go into the newsagent and see some signs on the thing, and either they would post something and people would reply to that. So the way you reached your victims was much, much more limited. With a hyper-connected world that we live in, you can reach far more victims. So the technology certainly mediates, but it's always ultimately the human dynamic that makes it possible. Having said that, Geoff used a really interesting word, which was value. And I think we have to really engage with what we think of in terms of value if we have to understand how financial crime, fraud is working in the technology-mediated world that we live in. And one example I gave already is data. So if you'd have said to somebody in the 1920s that, a spreadsheet is going to be as valuable as gold or oil, whatever cliche is going, then they probably would have looked at you very strangely. Now we know that you can buy and sell data for huge amounts of money in the digital crime economy. So data has acquired value. Likes on Facebook have acquired value. You can buy and sell them. In terms of, trading that leads to money laundering, Geoff mentioned in-game currencies, and they are a very interesting one. My son plays Minecraft all the time, and Roblox and these kind of things. And it's really interesting seeing how they buy and sell. But of course, the criminal's got in there and has found a conduit to convert that into something else. But things like gift cards as well. In a sense, they have value as a card which you can exchange for a gift. But they have another kind of value, which is as a money laundering tool of all kinds. So I think we have to kind of both zoom in on what the technology is actually doing, but then zoom out and bear in mind that it's really just a term of art that's used to describe what human beings are doing. And they're doing it more effectively, and they're doing it at a bigger scale because technology augments the body in all kinds of important ways. So, we talk about... say fraud, you can break it down into several stages where technology is playing a role. There's the acquisitional bit where you get, say, credentials to be able to conduct frauds. And there's all kinds of little tools you can use for that now, such as info stealers. You could use online marketplaces. You can use these clouds of logs. You can do key logging. You can obviously use data breaches. So that's the stage one. Stage two, then when you actually conduct the fraud, you might do... What kind of fraud might you conduct? You might do a crypto theft. You might do an account takeover. You might do a SIM swap. You might do a biometrics spoof. And then you have to process it. And then you might use a fund transfer, crypto, digital payment systems. So certainly at every stage of the fraud process, there is a particular type of technology that's assisting in the process. I won't say enabling, but it's extending your capacity to be able to conduct that. So I think we have to look at technology from the macro scale and the micro scale, and understand how those two things fit together, and don't use lazy terms like all crime today is technology crime, because actually technology crime is, and I've written a lot about this to try and as trying to argue against this, is that technology crime's been around since you hit somebody on the head in a cave with a stone. There's no difference really. We have to distinguish between low tech and high tech, and again, that's not done in this space very well. People tend to look at the high tech way in which crimes are conducted, but there's lots of very low tech ways as well. And I'll stop there.
That brings me on to my next question. Do we think that criminals use technology to perpetrate crime as a kind of status symbol? So the more advanced the technology that you use, the better criminal you are, the more advanced, the more knowledgeable, because it could be shown as, it could be seen as a sign of greater intelligence compared to someone who isn't necessarily well versed in technology. Is that something that counter financial crime academics and practitioners should be wary of?
That's not one I'd thought about. That is interesting. I think there is, in terms of how high-tech criminals feel about themselves, there is the possibility of them feeling more divorced from their victims and from the crime, because if you're phoning somebody up and you're listening to them and then you're stealing their money, you have to have a certain level of psychological resilience not to feel any sympathy for them. Doing that via email it's a lot simpler. But Michael, I wonder whether that, in terms of the prestige of tech crime, I wonder if that's interesting. Does that come up in your conversations with convicts and so on?
Yeah, I mean, to an extent. I mean, a lot of people I spoke to were actually, a surprisingly large amount of them were basically just trying to pay the bills. A lot of them were operating on quite a mundane level, even insider cyber criminals, inside organisations. A lot of them told me that I got behind on the mortgage payments, or I had the kids' school uniforms to pay for, and this kind of thing. So there's we can't discount that sector of criminality in the digital crime world. And I think in terms of the prestige of it, I mean, it in a sense that's a little bit old-fashioned now. Because it was very much in the mid 1990s, the kind of the tech savvy kid in the basement showing off to his friends and doing the latest hack and so on. That certainly hasn't gone away. I mean, I think with the group they've just done some arrests, haven't they? This Scattered Spider group who did Marks & Spencer's. They think they did it, although there's been quite a few retail attacks around the world. I'm not sure that they're responsible for all of those, but that's another question anyway. But I think certainly there are tales still of people bragging to each other on forums about they did this and they pulled that one off. There was a lot of kudos that came from some of the supply side attacks, like SolarWinds in the States and so on the international level. But I think it would be slightly wrong to overplay that because for at least two reasons. One is the cybercrime as a service market, where which is very profitable and is enabling all kinds of people who've got no technical skills whatsoever to engage in cybercrime. You can hire a botnet, you can hire ransomware, you get updates on how it's functioning, you can get tech support all the way through the time you're using it. So there's no shame in being sort of a bit of a tech beginner if you're a cybercrime criminal, because what you're interested in is the revenues. There is also the fact that a lot of this stuff is playing out on a global stage, and you're really wanting to handle this in quite a professional way. So if we look at a lot of the Russian cyber criminal gangs, I'd be very interested to hear what some of Geoff's inside knowledge on some of these guys are. But a lot of these Russian cybercrime gangs are incredibly professionalized, major ties with government, major ties with military, and so on. So yeah, there's the human element that look at us, we've got all these contacts and we're doing this, but really what counts is how effective and how professional they are in achieving the goals that they want to achieve. So I'd say professionalism is more of perhaps more of a psychological motivator now than it was in the mid 1990s when it's look how clever I am.
Well, yeah, it's interesting. The podcast series that I'm researching, we're looking particularly at a sort of nexus of ransomware gangs who most people know as Conti, but also has various other names that they operated under and pieces of software that they used that they became known by. And what's brilliant about that is during the outbreak of the Ukraine war, somebody who was aggrieved at Conti's stance on the Ukraine war, i.e. pro-Kremlin, leaked hundreds of thousands of messages from inside that gang. And you can see on a really, really granular level how the gang operated. What's interesting to me going through those leaks is they almost never seem to talk about the actual attacks they're doing. That's probably discussed in different chat rooms, but the main thrust, certainly of the senior leadership within Conti, was all about recruitment. It was all about recruitment and management. How do we get people in through the door? We need another 50 coders. Where are we going to get them? Because, by the way, we can't be honest about what we do when we recruit. We've got to go on a job site and say it's a tech job for you. And then when we recruit, how do we pay these people? And they're talking about the salaries that Google and Microsoft will pay in Russia. Remember, a lot of this was early part of the Ukraine war. And they say, we can't pay these guys as much. How can we incentivize them? What bonus schemes can we put in place? So that, it is an incredibly well-organized, well-oiled machine. And actually, a researcher I was speaking to just now from Cyjax was saying, you've got to realize if your cyber security team in your organization is 5 people, sometimes it might be, you on the other side of the equation is an organization of 200 people. They have 200 members. That's how many they quote internally. And there's no reason to disbelieve that figure. They have a bunch of people who do open source intelligence on their victims, surveilling their victims, bunch of people who do the initial access and pop the target, bunch of people who drop the ransomware, bunch of people who do the negotiation, bunch of people who launder it. That's your key kill chain, to use the phrase, bunches of people, all organised in teams, all working, all coordinated. It's a really impressive outfit to watch, actually. So that's the insight from inside the gangs as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That kind of granular detail. You're right. Conti was a rare opportunity to really have a peek behind the veil. The Russian cyber gangs are incredibly impressive in terms of their organizational capacities, as you've pointed out. Their willingness to direct their actions in strategic ways. It's always been hard to establish just how much of a handle the Kremlin has got on some of these people. But it's certainly post-Ukraine war. It's become apparent that many of them are operating, in ways that at least support state objectives, as well as in some ways actively realise it. And in that sense, we're back to the prestige question. It is really much about getting the job done. As you say, the mechanics of functioning as a criminal group, and that's a great story about how do you compete with the salaries of Microsoft and Google.
Coming back to how technology plays a role in perpetrating crime, I'm trying not to say enable now, Michael, otherwise I'm going to get glared at. Do we need to govern technology more closely, or is the focus still going to be on how do we govern the person? How do we educate the person?
Geoff, I'll defer to you on this.
There will always be people who want to commit crime and want to, and I will use the term enable crime, want to be part of the crime scene, which largely comes down to human laziness, doesn't it? Lots of people want to get rich quick, and the presence of cryptocurrency in this sort of proves that had you got into Bitcoin early on, you would be rich by now. So there's that narrative of get rich quick. There'll always be people who want to take advantage of that. I do think in terms of regulation, that's an interesting question. The problem you've got with regulation, particularly around those new realms of finance I talked about, video games, cryptocurrencies, things like NFTs, new ways of using blockchain technology, regulation will just never be able to catch up with and encapsulate all of it. Because by the time you've drafted your regulation, some dude in some academic institution or just in their bedroom will have written 5 lines of code that just busted straight through it. Yeah. So you, as a regulator, you're always trying to sort of draw up this very, very broad regulation, which immediately gets you into trouble because you have to then consult really widely and there's loads of controversy around it. But what you're trying to do is sort of throw a net around the future and encapsulate the next maybe 5 years, if you're lucky, of technology development. I think that has to happen. It will happen, but the idea that's the solution, I'm not entirely sure about. For me, a better thing for regulators and legislators to do in this space is speak to and understand the people doing these new types of technology in this space. As I say, technologists don't really want to enable crime. It's not what they set out to do. What they want to do is disrupt, innovate, create. If you can have a conversation with them and say, well, what are you working at? Well, that's really interesting. Explain how that works. By the way, you do realise how a criminal could misuse this. You can start to get buy-in from within that tech community because you're not coming in after the fact and saying, oh, good piece of tech there, buddy, going to regulate that out of business. You understand that innovation is happening, but you sort of drop in this thing of like, well, if you want this to take off, you are going to have to be responsible about it at some stage and stop the criminality. The case on this, the absolute brilliant case, is coming up in the US courts, I think in the next couple of weeks. It's the Tornado Cash prosecution. Tornado Cash was a crypto mixer, as the name suggests, takes incoming crypto, mixes it, spits it out to a fresh wallet address. Useful for preserving privacy, yes, also useful for laundering money. North Korea is accused of washing $455 million through Tornado Cash. The process took a few weeks to do that. The US government obviously accused North Korea of it, but they went after Tornado Cash. And one of the founders of that piece of technology, a guy called Roman Storm, is in court in the next few weeks in the US. And it's going to be fascinating to see how that case goes, because at the heart of it is freedom of speech. The idea that we should be able to have private transactions, and in a world of digital currency, that's harder. There's also the coders, techies point of view, which is, if I invent technology and it gets misused in the future by a bad actor, am I liable for that? Am I on the hook for that? On the US government side, there's the idea of, well, this is sanctions evasion helping North Korea. And also, you are a financial institution, whether you like it or not. You are covered by these regulations. So if you want to see this debate played out in real time, just start following the Roman Storm trial as it is in the next few weeks. It's going to be super, super fascinating. So that's where the sort of technology kind of, can we regulate it? Can we control it? I think that's a really key case to watch.
Mm.
Yeah, that's very interesting. The how they're targeting mixers there, and of course, some jurisdictions have actually outlawed mixers altogether. And I think Germany has got legislation where they're trying to, limit, if you try and use mixers, then potentially you're committing an offence. So that's an example of one type of way where you directly target the technology in order to regulate the crime. But I think you've got to, I think about this in terms of what I call the three C's, in terms of where tech regulation is focused and how it should work. So you've got the crime, content, and control. So in terms of crime, you're almost on a losing battle, as Geoff pointed out. This is the famous metaphor, Paul Ekblom's metaphor of the arms race, where you're always going to be trying to out-innovate the cyber criminal, and they will find, a new way into the network, behind the network, through from inside the network. That's, your cybersecurity, which I have criticised on a number of occasions, gets a huge amount of money. It generates a huge amount of money. It's one of the biggest industries in the world, but it's pretty well doesn't work. We're paying all this money and it doesn't work because it goes on. And I think that's always you can't remove it, but whether you can regulate through, because there's regulation here, we're talking about building firewalls, building technical ways. So purely technical regulation, I think, is always going to be tricky. You can target certain types of technologies that fuel the digital crime economy, like mixers. And clearly there's some pretty major gaps here at the moment. If you look at the advent of something like the meme coin, which has got to be one of the biggest money laundering devices ever created, it's funding corruption at the highest level of society. That Donald Trump is using his own meme coin as a way of basically grifting the American state. So whether you want to have an audience with Donald Trump, you have to invest in his meme coin. If you want to get certain favors, you have to invest in his meme coin. So it's clearly something could be regulated in terms of how that stuff is used. The trouble is, because of where it's taking place in terms of the social hierarchy, it's almost impossible at this point in history, because people like Trump, Putin, all of the authoritarian leaders have got their grips on, the mechanisms the law, which you could use to regulate that. And that's actually the third point, which I'll come back to in a minute, which is control. Secondly, content. Here there can be regulation, and we can see people trying this. The new regulations, for example, that are going to come in around, online viewing pornography. The government is trying to set up mechanisms whereby you'll have to age verify. We know there's going to be huge problems with that, or people will verify something, or they'll go through through other means, VPLs and so on, to kind of get around it. But probably most of us will agree that there's some form of regulation to stop children viewing extreme content online is something that we would want. Hate speech, other forms of content, hugely problematic. We know that the law has been enacted against people who are making hate speech online in the UK at the moment. People are being arrested, put in prison because of what happened in Southport. So probably there is likely to be some form of tech regulation in terms of that. AI moderators, we haven't even spoken about AI at all yet, by the way, but moderation through AI devices, that's technology regulating content, that there's going to be some space for that. And finally, control in terms of the people, the powerful, because we mustn't forget that the powerful players in the digerati, the technorati, are responsible for a lot of the problems that in this space, whether it's to do with fraud or whether it's to do with other kinds of abuse. And we've seen like antitrust legislation to try and stop the control of very large platforms abusing their users and abusing other businesses. There's regulation coming in there. But I think and I think it's where perhaps you slightly take issue with Geoff's idea that the big technorati are not interested in using their technology to commit crime. They're certainly perfectly comfortable with it being used to commit crime, because a lot of them are opposed to democracy, are opposed to the rule of law. So Peter Thiel, for example, the guy who basically created PayPal, who now runs a very sinister piece of technology called Palantir, which spies on people, which governments use to oppress citizens who are challenging. He has openly come out and said that his project is to use technology to disrupt the state, to destroy the state, because he doesn't think democracy works. So on those three levels, crime, content and control, technology can clearly play a role, and there needs to be regulation, but we need to be very, very serious about this. And just finally, on the AI point, we know that there are all sorts of programs which, someone like myself who works in a university, the problem we have now of AI written essays is just horrific. And most of us are arguing that, yes, we could introduce new AI-driven systems to assess whether something is AI, but we then arrive at this bizarre situation where university life is about AI being regulated by AI. So the student and the lecturer disappear from this process whatsoever. So we know that there's issues around AI and how we regulate it. We also know that the people who are developing the AI, whether it's Elon Musk or whoever else it might be, are openly opposed to regulating AI. They don't want it to be, because they think it's limiting business opportunities. So I think there is a very, very big tension here between who wants the technology to regulate the technology and who doesn't.
Very interesting. Geoff, final thoughts from you?
On the cybercrime side, I'll be honest with you, AI is being used by cyber criminals, but in the very same way that's being used by better phishing emails, audit your code, all that kind of thing. We've not, as far as I'm aware, seen the big sort of step change use of AI by cyber criminals. On the defensive side, AI is being used all the time. Machine learning, as we used to call it in the industry. So I think, the momentum is with the defender side on the cybercrime with AI at the moment, I think. On the fraud side, it's a completely different thing, because fraud, as Michael said, is deception and deception-based crime. AI, generative AI particularly, is hugely useful in that. We are seeing a step change in fraudulent ability, and we will continue to see it on that side. So I think that's really, that's, if you're looking at AI for malicious use, it's the fraud side for me rather than the cybercrime side where I see the big threat coming from.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Well, that is all we have time for. I could listen to you both all day, but I'm afraid I can't. So thank you very much to both Michael and to Geoff for joining me today to talk about fraud and technology. My name's Claire Maillet, and this is Fraudible.